Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience and your tolerance of that inexplicable high-pitched shrieking. We're delighted to have you all here tonight for a very special event here at the store. My name is John, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are here in Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuit, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are here, of course, to celebrate a very special evening with Marc Garneau, Canada's first man in space. He is here to discuss his memoir, A Most Extraordinary Ride, Space, Politics, and the Pursuit of a Canadian Dream, to which you may applaud if you so desire. In this book, Marc Garneau chronicles his once improbable ascent from a mischievous teenager and rebellious naval midshipman to a decorated astronaut and statesman who represented Canada on the world stage, both on and off the planet. We're so pleased that Penguin Random House of Canada published this book through their imprint Signal and made this evening a possibility. You won't have to tolerate me for very long. I'm just going to very quickly tell you a little bit about the evening and then introduce both of our very special guests. There'll be a conversation that'll take place just to my left between our host, Paul Samyn, and Marc Garneau. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for you gathered here to ask questions. So please do allow those to percolate over the evening. When it does come time for a Q&A, I will approach you in a hopefully non-threatening manner with this handheld microphone, and then you'll be able to ask your question. At the close of the event, I'll be back to review signing procedure. The only thing I will put in your mind right now is that we'll ask you all to remain in your place just for one moment while we safely transport our guest of honor to the signing table just beside our cash desk. Now, the one thing that is almost an unspoken rule is that I could speak extemporaneously about a book, or if Romeo Dallaire has something to say about it, I should probably defer to him. And he says, in A Most Extraordinary Ride, Marc Garneau tells us much more than how to become an astronaut or a politician. With honesty and optimism, he shares how to rise again and again from life's falls and failures, pushes and punches, all the way to the stars. Which seems like a solid way of easing into our introductions of our guests. Our host for this evening, Paul Samyn, has been part of the Free Press newsroom for more than a quarter century, working his way up after starting as a rookie news reporter in 1988. And if you count the time he spent delivering the newspaper as a boy growing up in St. James, his connection to the Free Press goes back even further. As a reporter, Paul wrote for every section of the paper, covered elections, wars overseas, and the funerals of a royal princess and a prime minister. The graduate of the University of Winnipeg and Red River College helped lead the Free Press's political coverage for a decade as its Ottawa bureau chief before being named city editor in 2007. In the summer of 2012, Paul was promoted to editor, becoming only the 15th person to hold that office since the Free Press began publishing in 1872. Our very special guest, Marc Garneau, has distinguished himself in 3 distinct fields. As a Navy officer with the Canadian Armed Forces, he spent 10 years as a combat systems engineer. In 1984, Garneau became the first Canadian astronaut to go to space, and from 2001 to 2005, he was president of the Canadian Space Agency. As a federal politician, he has served as Liberal House Leader, Minister of Transport, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. He lives in Montreal with his wife and has 4 children, and we're delighted that he's here tonight with us. Please give a very warm Winnipeg welcome to Paul Samyn and Marc Garneau.
Testing, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, you can.
Houston, can you hear us? We're good to go, are we? Is that working? There we go.
There we go.
Excellent.
I'm done. We're ready.
We're counting. Good evening, and thank you, John, and thank you everyone for coming out. We're gonna roll back the clock, 40 years. Okay, ready? We're gonna go to the Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, Florida. Okay? I want you to all fasten your seatbelts and make sure your seats are in the locked and upright position, right? It is T-minus 1 minute, and we're gonna go to see some history. Right? I don't know if you remember that day, but if we went back to exactly October 5th, 1984, 11:03 UCT, that's Coordinated Universal Time, and on the launch pad is the challenge. Mission STS-41G, 10, 9, 8, go for main engine start. 7, 6, we have main engine start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have SRB ignition, and the history's largest astronaut crew is on its way. Houston controlling now, all main engines running at 100%. That's what NASA was telling us as we watched that moment in history when the first Canadian took space. I have goosebumps right now. Mark, 40 years later, still get goosebumps?
I do, and you did that very well, Paul, I have to say. You took me back 40 years.
There you go. We're gonna do more than 40 years of conversation here. I have the opportunity to ask Mark some questions, and then we're gonna turn the floor over to you. On that day, you and had the good fortune, because the flight path, or the flight plan, I should say, for the space shuttle kept you kind of going around Canada or over Canada. So you were really high up, you're in space, okay? I'm gonna bring you right back to Earth, because I've got the front page from that day. Now, John, if you can bring that out. So this is our front page, Mark. I don't think you had a chance to see it because it was too far away. Okay, but if you look at, this is, I'm bringing back down to Earth. So headline, Marc Garneau, first Canadian in outer space. Actually, the Queen got top billing that day. Queen was welcomed with pomp and color. So there's your front page.
Thank you.
I'll give you the turn. There's no pictures of you, but you do see the Queen inspecting the honor guard. You did have a chance to meet the Queen, I think, at least once, perhaps twice. Did you complain about the fact that she bumped you off the front page?
I did not. But it was a delightful encounter with her when she came to Canada on the 50th, on her 50th anniversary, the Golden Jubilee. So, but I didn't bring that up.
You didn't bring that up, okay. And what's interesting, and you talk about in the book, as part of her Jubilee, you were part of a distinguished group of Canadians, and you would have been representing 1984.
84, yeah.
All right, little souvenirs on the book tour. Now, my grade 1 yearbook from Strathmore School. You know how they remember used to ask you what your ambition was? You know what my ambition was? I wanted to be an astronaut. Okay, that's what it said. Probably because I had watched the Apollo launches, and that's what I wanted to be. So obviously I didn't get to chase that dream. So it's kind of special for you and me to be talking tonight. But because of that ambition that I had as a child growing up here in Winnipeg, there's a passage on page 76. So I'm going to read it. I just want you to riff off that a little bit. So I'm going to turn to page 76 here. And I'm going to try and do this without putting my reading glasses on. Okay. When we are young, we have an imagination that allows us to think that almost anything is possible. Our thinking is not bound by the laws of physics. As we grow up, we begin to lose that kind of almost pure imagination as our parents and teachers tell us about the real world, and we learn that some things are just not possible. Some of us hold on to our imagination longer than others, but we all eventually realize that on Earth we can not do certain things, such as float across a room suspended in midair. But guess what? In space, you can. It is a place where once again you become a child and rediscover the imagination you lost by growing up. This explains why serious adults laugh like children when they first arrive in space. Did you laugh?
I did. I had a big smile on my face as soon as I got up there because I was floating and I was being able to do something that I dreamed about and thought about as a child, but of course couldn't do. So, and I was no different from any of my other crewmates. There were 7 of us and we all had these big grins on our faces and it was magical.
Okay. But so that's great, but I want to get back to the imagination component. You're kind of a serious guy.
That's right.
But you seem to, when you look at your career, and it spans a variety of endeavors, not just the one you wrote up on. There has to be something about your imagination where you saw you having the possibility to do certain things. So I want to hear about imagination. Was that something you always had? Was it something that you found worked once or twice, so you stuck with it? So help me out here, because the fact that you and I are talking today, the fact that you got to space is as in the book reveals a lot about luck, but at some point I have to think that there was a power of imagination.
I think you're right. I think I was born curious. I always wanted to understand everything around me. I can remember, the first time I listened to a radio, I wondered, how does the music come out of that radio? When a car drives down the street, what happens under the hood that makes that engine run and through the transmission makes the wheels turn? And I wanted to know, I wanted to understand those things. So I think I was born curious. So that, of course, makes your imagination go wild sometimes. And of course, as you pointed out, when I was a child, perhaps some of the things I imagined were not realistic, but for me, they opened up all sorts of possibilities. And I've always had a sense of adventure. I wanted to get out there and do all sorts of things. And I think those are gifts that I don't know how they were in me, but they were there. And in my early life, sometimes they got me into trouble because I did some things that perhaps I shouldn't have done, some silly mistakes, and because I was driven to do certain things and was lacking perhaps some judgment. But I think I've always had a strong imagination and a desire to go out there and take a bite out of the world, and it's, I think, driven me my whole life. And sometimes it's ended up in dead ends, but sometimes it's ended up in the opportunity to do some fabulous things. And so that's the way I made it.
Okay. We as a society, we as a country, do we recognize the power of imagination? And I ask that question because I think the fact that we were able to put people on the moon, that we were able to come up with a space shuttle, a vehicle that could blast off and come back and be used again, was something that aspired. And the names of the shuttles, Endeavour, Challenger, the challenge that President Kennedy announced at his inauguration about putting someone on the moon by the end of the decade.
And bringing them back safely.
And bringing them back safely, which was a key thing. And I worry, and we're gonna get to politics a little bit, but I worry sometimes that we don't have that same ability to dare, to dream, to risk, to do something that seems improbable, impossible, beyond our reach. So work with me on that.
So Paul, I'm going to give you some examples of where we did that precisely in the space business. And I'm not talking about my flight now. I'm talking about the fact that Canada was the 3rd country in the world after the United States and the Soviet Union back in 1962 to design and build its own spacecraft. It was called Alouette 1. And the reason we built it was to go up and study the aurora, because scientists on the ground, primarily out here in the west of Canada, were looking at the aurora, and they wanted to understand how it performed and what caused this beautiful display of lights in the sky. And it was when the space age arrived with Sputnik in 1957 that some very visionary Canadian engineers and scientists said, we're going to build a spacecraft. And remember, back then, it was brand new. Building spacecraft that would have to be able to survive a launch, which is a very rough ride, and also space, which is a very hostile environment. And that satellite that was built, spacecraft, Alouette 1, was designed to work for 3 months, and they turned it off after 10 years of fully successful operation. That's one example. Canada was the first country in the world to have its own national communication satellite operator, because the government created Telesat in 1969 because it said, we're the second biggest country on Earth. We need to connect Canadians in the far north and all those remote regions. And we put Anik A1, our first communication satellite, up there in space. Canada was the first. Canada is a world leader in Earth observation using radar. Why do we use radar as opposed to cameras? Because there's lots of cloud over Canada and there's lots of darkness at night. The radar can see through darkness and it can see through cloud. So it made sense for us to build a radar, and we're now, this is the radar sat series of satellites. We were the ones who designed the Canadarm, the robotic arm. We approached, that's the reason I got a chance to fly in space, because an enterprising company called Spar Aerospace in Ontario decided that they were going to approach NASA and say to NASA, hey, you're building the space shuttle. We'd like to build the robotic arm, which is a key piece of the shuttle. And by the way, it flew 90 times and was perfect every time. And I operated it on 2 of my missions, so I know how well it operated. But Canada is the world leader in space robotics because of that. So yes, we did have some visionary people in the 20th century who did a great deal to put Canada on the map in space. And of course, we have to continue that.
That's the question, continuing. Obviously, everyone here is familiar with the voyages you took to space. I found interesting and I think it's foundational in terms of you. Another craft that had a somewhat less impressive name, the Pickle. You were aboard, how large was the Pickle?
It was a 57-foot sailboat, a yawl, for those who know sailing, a 2-masted sailboat.
Okay, so Apollo 11 is touching down on the Sea of Tranquility. You're somewhere approaching the British Isles. Can you just talk about that? And I laughed when I read that section about the Pickle, but the Pickle is actually quite important. So can you just take us through the Pickle?
So the Pickle was a Canadian training sailboat, and I had the chance with 12 other people, for a crew of 13, to participate in a race in 1969 between Newport, Rhode Island, and Cork, Ireland. And so we raced across the ocean with about 20 other sailboats, and it took about 20 days. And we had good weather and we had very bad weather. And it was a really wonderful experience for me to learn to be part of a team working in a difficult environment. And I think it made a difference later on when I applied to become an astronaut, that I had already demonstrated that I could be a good team member working in difficult circumstances. And I think that certainly helped me, because there are lots of parallels between being an astronaut and being in a sailboat crossing the ocean. But when we crossed and finished the race, we were in the English Channel, and it happened to be the night that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in their lunar lander landed in the Sea of Tranquility. And I was in the sailboat. It was a beautiful night. We could see the moon. We had turned on the radio and we were listening, spellbound, just like some of you may remember that moment. And I said to myself at that point, here I am in this almost one of the oldest forms of transportation in the world, a boat. And they have crossed 400,000 kilometers of space, the vacuum of space, and landed in the Sea of Tranquility. And it inspired me, and I thought, wow, maybe. I think that's when the seed was first planted in the back of my brain that perhaps one day I could have a chance to do something as exciting as that. Now, I never did go to the moon, but I did go to space. So.
I just noticed, this is Brooke, our photographer. Can anyone look at Brooke's shirt? Like, come on. That's a nice touch, Brooke. Okay, before we went on, I was joking with John and Chris from McNally here. It was literally a year ago that I had an opportunity to speak to someone else I also looked up to. I think he was my hero in grade 2. I went from being an astronaut, then I got playing hockey. Ken Dryden was here. And I find it interesting here that 1 year later, I'm again speaking to someone who has remarkable success and channels that into eventually into politics. So Ken's a Hall of Famer, a Hockey Hall of Famer. I think you're probably in the Space Hall of Fame. Does that thing exist? If not, you're probably could be inducted at some point. And then having had that kind of success and having that kind of worldview, you truly have a global view because you've stared at Earth from space. You make the decision to go into politics. So it makes sense that you're in the pickle staring up and you think about space. But at what point did it dawn on you that I'm going to go into a different pickle, and that would be politics?
Yes, many people have said to me, why did you go into politics? We liked you when you were an astronaut. So what actually happened, at that time I retired from being an astronaut and I was president of the Canadian Space Agency. So Canadian Space Agency is Canada's NASA. And I'd been there for 4 years and I'm really enjoying the job. But an election was looming and parties will approach people to see if they're willing to run as candidates. And a couple of Liberals came to my office one day and said, first of all, we'd like to check, are you a Liberal? And I said, yes, I am a Liberal. And well, would you like to run in the next election? And at first I thought to myself, why would I want to leave this really enjoyable job and do that? But I went home and thought about it. And the reason I chose to get involved in politics was because as president of the Canadian Space Agency, I was responsible to recommend to the government in what direction the Canada's space program should go. But ultimately, they were the ones that made those decisions. And then I had to execute. And I thought it would be nice to be on the other side of the table to be making some of those decisions. And I had very strong feelings about not just space, but science and technology in general. And so I thought, well, I'm 56, but maybe, and that's kind of old to get into politics, but I thought this is probably my last opportunity to take that gamble. And I decided after talking to my family and getting their blessing that I would try to do it. But as I've told many people, my timing sucked really badly because by then Canadians were tired of the Liberals. We'd had a 12-year run with Mr. Chrétien and then Mr. Martin. And then in Quebec, it was a very big deal, the sponsorship scandal as well. So I went into the eye of the storm when I ran the first time, but really enjoyed the experience enough that I stayed on and eventually did get elected.
Much like Ken, you wanted not just at one point made a decision, being elected is one thing. The equivalent, I guess, you wanted to be going from payload specialist to the commander. So much like Ken Dryden, you wanted to run for the leadership of the Liberal Party and potentially then the opportunity to become prime minister. So can you just explain that course correction?
So in 2013, the Liberals were very much in a deep, dark hole, and Stéphane Dion had led us into the 2011 election that had not gone, the 2008 election had not gone well at all, and he left. And then Michael Ignatieff took over, and the 2011 election was a disaster for the Liberal Party. We became the third party, as some of you may recall. We were down to 34 MPs, and we were in a deep hole. Really, some people were predicting the end of the Liberal Party in Canada. So there was a leadership race again in 2012-13, and somebody approached me and said, you should try and run for the leadership. And I decided to take that gamble, and I and 8 other contenders, so there were 9 of us, ran for the leadership of the Liberal Party in 2013. Now, of course, Justin Trudeau won that, and he won it handily, but I decided that I wanted to try to do it because I thought I had some good policy to offer Canadians, and I thought that I had a good track record of experience on which to run. But it was not to be, but I enjoyed that experience as well, and Justin Trudeau was chosen as our leader in 2013, and in 2015, as you all know by then, Canadians once again, because it happens about every 8-10 years, decided it's time for a new party, and elected the Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau.
That led then to roles as cabinet minister, as transport, and then foreign affairs. There's a really interesting discussion on page 139 of the book, and where it's the post-flight briefing, where they're asking how things went, but more importantly, they want to know what went wrong. You had to admit that you made 2 mistakes. Mm-hmm. Not small mistakes, yes. Potentially very problematic. Yeah. But that, as you point out, is part of the strength of the NASA space program, where the culture is, we need to make sure that we get things right, because you do not have room for error.
That's right.
Okay. Failure, as we have heard, is not an option. So you admitted those mistakes. I would suggest that's not the culture in politics.
And I would suggest that you're right.
Okay. And so transparency, admitting errors, owning errors. And you touch on this a little bit, but if we're going to talk about the Prime Minister who has been facing no shortage of challenges and problems, a minister resigned today, which only adds to the woes. How much of that is reflective of the political culture, or perhaps the way that Justin Trudeau sees things? Because I think in many cases, some of the challenges that the party is facing are to a degree reflections of decisions he's made and mistakes that he's not been willing to admit.
Well, let me start with sort of an overall picture. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, typically, when a government comes into power, sometimes it's a sort of a breath of fresh air, and everybody is sort of happy that a party has arrived in power because they've become tired of the previous party. And that's the way it started for us in 2015. But you cannot keep that sort of shiny luster indefinitely, because you make mistakes. And the Liberal Party has made mistakes, and the Prime Minister has made mistakes. And so eventually, Canadians sort of begin to tally these things up in their minds, and they don't forget about these things. And eventually, it comes close to a tipping point, and people starting to say, well, maybe it's time to kick them out and look at a new party. That's a cycle that repeats itself. I mean, after Mr. Harper was there for almost 10 years, people said it's time to bring in a new party. Now, in the case of Mr. Trudeau, he did win 3 elections in a row. The first was a majority, the next 2 were minorities. And he has made it clear that he will run in the next election, which will happen within the next year. I think because he has won 3 elections, he has earned the right to make the decision about whether he's going to run a fourth time. But having said that, he has to take into account the fact that there is a lot of discontent in the country. People are concerned that the Liberal Party is not addressing some of their concerns, which are sometimes related to cost of living issues, housing issues, and other issues. Secondly, we as a party, the Liberal Party, has been down in the polls by 15 to 20% for over a year. That's pretty unprecedented. And thirdly, there is unease in the caucus being all of the other members of the Liberal Party. So those are a lot of things. So if he does decide to stick it out and to run, he has to know that if it doesn't work out well, that he will be entirely responsible for that. So he does not appear to be in the mood to throw it out for a leadership race. So he's taking a very, very big gamble.
Do you think, is there a course correction that you could see or recommend that would allow him to do what he says he thinks Canadians want and would be recognized at the ballot box?
Well, that's the course correction that you mentioned is the key thing. Unless you can put something in the window that shows Canadians that you are addressing their concerns, unless you can do that, Canadians are going to say it's time for somebody else. And so far, that has not happened.
Now, I know politicians hate hypothetical questions, but you're no longer a politician. So
Doesn't mean I don't hate them.
That's right, okay. Elon Musk phoned you.
Yes.
Elon's got rockets. One blasted off yesterday at his operation in Texas. He has visions of going to Mars. So Elon calls you and says, Mark, you've been there before. What do you say? Do you go?
To Mars?
With Elon. Can you take him with you? Please.
So I've been asked a lot of questions about Elon in the last few weeks. Fancy that, but I've met Elon Musk, and I will speak about him in two parts. The first part is that obviously he's a very successful businessman. He has something of a visionary in him. If you look at SpaceX and what he's done with Tesla and Starlink, and so you have to acknowledge that part. But I also am very, very disturbed by some of his thinking. So I have to put that part of it in there as well. I guess there's no such thing as a super successful person who's a genius and is also, if I can put it this way, well-adjusted. And I'm very, very concerned about some of his recent, obviously related to the Trump election. So I'm very, very disturbed by that. But I do acknowledge the fact that he has been an incredibly successful businessman.
Okay. I didn't hear an answer as to whether or not you're going.
Well, if the technology was there, okay, now you have to remember, going to orbit takes 8.5 minutes to get to orbit. That's all. And you go around the Earth every 90 minutes. To go to the moon's about a 3-day trip. But to go to Mars is a 6-month trip if you go at the right time. It's longer if you don't go at the right time. And you're gone for 1.5 years, and it's going to be 6 months to come back. So it's a 2.5-year round trip. So at this point in my life, the answer was, even if it was all ready on the launch pad, probably I wouldn't go. But I will tell you that there are a lot of people that would jump at the opportunity.
One last question before we turn to you folks here. The book reveals that Mark's a bit of a Trekkie. Question for the crowd here, is he Spock or is he Kirk? Anyone? Give him the answer. What are you?
I'm definitely Mr. Spock.
Okay. Sorry? Well, that's in the next
I
generation.
like that, I like that.
So, you talk that your sort of orientation is more Spock-like
Yeah.
logic. Is there, over the passage of time and also your political experience, did you add elements of Captain Kirk to your persona? Or did you say, I'm in the Spock lane, damn it, and a Vulcan I shall be and live long and prosper?
Well, my inclination is to be like Mr. Spock. I'd like to, things must be logical for me to accept them. So I'm always driven that way, but also sometimes logic can be very cold and can be, you know, when you come to a conclusion that is not a happy conclusion, but it's the logical one, or you come to a conclusion about needing to do something in a certain way, but it's not easy. It's a little bit harder. So I think over time I've added a little bit of Captain Kirk into it, because he sometimes was able to be successful by adding in a little bit of human emotion to his decision making. But I am primarily driven by logic. Does it make sense? Because I'm an engineer and I have to obey the laws of physics. You can't fool around with the laws of physics, and as an astronaut, even less. So that's my makeup. It doesn't mean that I don't imagine all sorts of other possibilities, but when it comes to making decisions, and that's how I approach my cabinet portfolios in transport and foreign affairs, is that if we were going to make a decision about something, it had to be logical as far as possible.
Okay. You are 75 years old. You have gone further than any of us have ever gone, right? That is not in dispute. So the question I have for you is, what wrench are you looking for next? Now, when I say wrench, if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about, but there's a wonderful story about a training exercise as a naval diver. You had to go down where it's dark and you had to find the wrench at the bottom. And hopefully you could do that before you run out of air. And you always didn't manage to find the wrench. So any wrenches you're looking for?
Well, now that I've officially told my family that I'm retired, and I've been retired for a year and a half, I've climbed all my mountains. I'm not saying I won't climb some small hills between now and the end, but I think my biggest hope at this moment, the wrench, is to be really skilled in the kitchen. That may sound weird, but I really enjoy cooking now, something I'm discovering, and something that, if you do it well, is very creative. And my wife is very happy that I've decided to do this. And I realized, and it's something my mother told me when I was growing up, she said that the hardest part is not the cooking itself, it's deciding what's for supper. And I see a lot of nods there. And so trying to decide what are we going to have tonight is part of it, and trying to be original. And so this may sound very trivial for me to say that I'm excited about cooking, but it is really exciting, and I'm enjoying that tremendously.
Who would have thought? Cooking, the final frontier. Anyways, I'm just mindful of the clock, okay? And we're now going to turn to questions, okay? We're gonna have the roving mic. I'm gonna ask something here. I'm not gonna overrule, I'm gonna ask two things. One, the question he's asked most about is going to the toilet in space. Buy the book, it's on page 75, okay? Goes into great detail. Number one and number two, okay? So I'm just trying to spare you, but there may back to that question. When the Free Press, we wrote about Marc Ben Sigurdsson, our literary writer and editor, at a piece, and part of that, talking about this event, led to one reader sending me a question. So, hey, Ken, I'm going to start with this question just to get things off, and in part because it does not involve bodily functions in space. Okay, so this comes from Ted Scholes. He wants to go back to your transportation minister days, the Boeing 737 MAX grounding in 2019. He says, as you recall, it was a massive issue at the time as 2 planes had just crashed, but the US under President Trump then was holding back on grounding the planes, saying that everything was okay. It seems that once Garneau made the announcement that Canada was grounding, then the US did finally the same later in the day or the next day. So the question for you, Mark, is what was the timeline of yours and Transport Canada's views, and how did that impact or interact with the US finally making their announcement?
Very directly, in fact, when we made the decision at Transport Canada to ground the MAX 8, as you'll recall, there were two tragedies with it, and we found the evidence that it was a similar profile in terms of the airplane going up and down, and eventually losing that fight and going down. My staff and my department called the United States and told the Secretary of Transport that we, for the reasons that I've just described to you, had decided that we were going to ground the MAX 8, and 2 hours later they did the same thing. So I think our analysis played an important role in that decision.
Good. Over to you, John.
Thanks. For Mr. Garneau, a logistical question. So I've been told, and I just want you to tell me how wrong I am, or right maybe, that you talk about imagination and hard work and brain power to get to become an astronaut, but sometimes it's just the fickleness of timing. And for example, this is what I was told years ago, and I didn't know it was true, that a group of astronauts will train together for years, and then the launch won't go because of weather. And then another team comes and they take the next launch anyway, it's their turn. So I wonder, you're the first astronaut from Canada. Was it fate or hard work and all that stuff? But was there someone in behind you that was waiting for their chance?
It's a good question, and you're right. Is sometimes timing and being in the right place at the right time makes things happen the way you'd like them to happen. I will say this in relation to that, and I mentioned it in the book. When I went down to train at the Johnson Space Center in 1984 for my first mission, the US astronauts who were in training at that point, some of whom had been training for years, saw this Canadian arrive on their doorstep and be assigned to a mission that was going to occur in October of that year. And I did feel a certain cold shoulder from some of them, because they were saying, you know, how come this Canadian is just arriving at the last minute and he's going to take our place on the space shuttle? So that did happen. Now, the reason that I was, the timing for that was because NASA wanted to thank Canada for designing the Canadarm and wanted to fly the Canadian, and in fact, they also flew a European because they designed the European space module that was on the shuttle, and they wanted to fly us right away. So it was partly politically driven, but it did cause some resentment from some of the US astronauts, and fortunately, not with my crew. The crew were fantastic with me, and we had a great mission. And I can understand them. Some of them, one of them had been training for 19 years for a flight. And here I was, you know, I'd been chosen less than a year before, and I flew within 10 months. So I can understand their feelings about that. So timing is sometimes goes to your advantage.
I wanted to go back 60 years. To Rome.
Maybe use the microphone and say.
Is it ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Going back to Rome, where two young boys, 14 and 15 years old, were traveling and exploring. Mentioning your explorations. You know, you were Columbus as a 14-year-old boy. They were stationed. His father was in the High Commission in London at the time, and they were traveling across all of Europe, the two of them, 14 and 15 years old, and they knew more about the artwork in Europe than what we had in the tourist books. The only thing that I wanted to mention here is that you forgot something in Rome. Your ravioli. So I'm tribute to you now after 60 years. Hope that that helps your food bill a little bit.
Well, thank you very much. Good Italian ravioli here. Thank you, sir. Yes. What the gentleman was referring to was the fact that my brother and I, my father was working in London, England, and in the last summer before we came back to Canada, my father was military. So in the last summer before coming back, my brother and I, he was a year older than me, said, Dad, and I have to correct one thing. I was 15, he was 16, so I was 15 and 16. Yeah, but still pretty young. We persuaded our parents to let us go off through Europe, just the two of us, and we'd stay in youth hostels. And my father gave us $3 a day and paid for our youth hostels and our train ticket to go through Europe. And we went off for 30 days and had this opportunity to go through Italy to places like Rome and Venice and Florence, and to see the marvelous art from the Renaissance. And that was a wonderful experience, and not sure that people would be safe doing that today at 15 or 16, but back then it worked out very well, and it was a wonderful adventure. And we were gone for 30 days and came back with all sorts of stories. Thank you.
Mark, this might be a really tough question, but can you speak about the greatest moment of your aeronautical career? Is there one thing that really stands out and a pretty hard to answer of all, the space, etc.? Is there one particular thing that just
sticks out?
Is number one?
Absolutely. My commander on the first mission, Bob Crippen, used to answer that question by saying the bit between the launch and the landing. But I'll try to zero in a little bit more. It was probably the first time that when we arrived in space and they cut off the engines and we were in space and going at 28,000 kilometers an hour, and I took off my seatbelt and I floated over and looked out the window and saw Earth below. That is burned into my brain until the day I die. That moment on my first flight was the most significant moment, I think, in my astronaut career. There's no question about that, because, there's a kind of a sense of disbelief. Am I looking at a picture here? Am I dreaming about this? No, I'm up here, I'm floating, I'm looking out the window, and we're just approaching the coast of Europe. And it was just absolutely mesmerizing.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
The first time I met you, I was 5, and it was at I think at the Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. And I don't remember what you said to me, but I know you made me feel very special as a little boy. You spoke to me, and like Paul, I also wanted to be an astronaut when I grew up, and I still do, even though I know it's not going to happen. And after I met you, we went to the gift shop, and my parents bought me freeze-dried astronaut ice cream, and I thought this was great. And we went back, and that night I ate it, and it made me so sick I threw up. I was devastated. I thought I can never be an astronaut. So my question to you is, since you like cooking so much, what things taste good or bad in space? Like what did you like to eat, or what was surprising?
Good question, good question. By the way, we don't eat that astronaut ice cream in space either. It's a little bit of a NASA gimmick, but it's commercially very popular with young people. And I agree with you. It's not the best in the world, but up there, things taste. You want more. You tend to want to add spice to things because things taste blander, and they taste sweeter too. So there are some small, subtle changes in your sense of taste. What I like the most, and I have to explain this, is when you go into weightlessness, there's a fluid shift because the intertissue liquids that are down in your lower body migrate up into your upper body and into your face. You know, my face on Earth was not as full as the face here. But because I was in space, in weightlessness, it tends to fill up your face. And some people get stuffy noses. It's like they have the feeling like they have the flu. Their nose feels stuffed up because of that fluid shift into the upper body. It's actually called, scientific name for it is chicken legs, puffy face. That's the NASA definition of it. And so my favorite food was actually shrimp cocktail. Now you're gonna say shrimp cocktail in space. Yes, they had it. And the reason we loved it is because you know that orange horseradish sauce that is with the shrimps? It cleared your nostrils. And so I had it at least once a day while I was up there. I really enjoyed that. But otherwise, the food was mostly dehydrated food and it's pretty bland. I'm told it's much better now, 40 years later up on the space station where they go up for 6 months and food becomes very, very, very important. But it was certainly nutritious and it's a little bit like camping, eating that kind of camping food. Yeah.
Hi, I'm very excited about the Artemis program.
Yes.
And Artemis 2, the first crewed mission beyond low Earth orbit since 1972, will have a Canadian astronaut on board. I was wondering if I could have your thoughts on Canada's future endeavors and the Artemis program, and the potential for Canadian astronauts on the surface of the moon someday.
So you're 100% right. Canadian Jeremy Hansen will be on the Artemis 2 mission, and I think it'll take off probably sometime in 2026. They want to make sure they're ready for it. And they won't land on the moon, but they'll go around the moon. So this will be the first time that a non-American goes as far as around the moon. So that is a real feather in Canada's cap because only Americans have been with the Apollo program, and that was 50 years ago, have been to the moon. And on this mission, there would be 4 people, 3 Americans and a Canadian. So that speaks to the quality of our astronauts, the fact that we will have Jeremy Hansen up there doing that. We are part of this program called Artemis, which is a return to the moon for a whole bunch of reasons. And I can't predict you when a Canadian will walk on the moon, but I think it'll happen within my lifetime for sure, because we're involved with it. We're going to contribute another bunch of robotics and also a rover to go around on the surface of the moon. So I think there's some exciting possibilities, and you're probably just in the right age range there to be ready when that moment comes.
So my question's a bit less grand in scale. I see that you wear glasses.
Yes.
And I perhaps incorrectly would have assumed that glasses wouldn't really be able to be worn in space. Zero G would have made it difficult.
Yeah.
And so, how was it wearing glasses in space? And are you allowed to go up into space with glasses now?
Yeah, as long as they correct your vision to 2020, if they make that correction, that's fine. And many people just put I forget what you call it, but it's a device that goes around your head so that they won't sort of drift off your face. So, and it's not a problem to have glasses up there. You don't have to become an astronaut have perfect vision. Very few people have perfect vision anyway. So yeah, it's not a problem.
And we do have time for one more question, so I'm going to give it to you folks over here.
Hey, Mark.
Hi.
Question is, what set of skills helped you feel confident about transitioning, from engineering that's very scientific, paperwork, formulas, into, a public-facing domain and leadership? Like, what kind of set of skills made you feel like this I can do?
So it's a very good question. And one of the things that happened when I applied to become an astronaut was that what drove me to to apply was the thought of, wow, perhaps if my dream comes true, I will get the chance to go up into space. That's what I was thinking about. What I didn't think about and didn't realize when I applied was that if I became successful, I would become a public figure. And that's a big adjustment in your life, because I could, before I became an astronaut, I could go anywhere and nobody would know me except people, my friends and relatives. But once I became an astronaut, there was a tremendous amount of interest in Canada in what kind of people astronauts were. So our pictures were all over the place. And so I had to adjust to the fact that I was now a public figure and that people could stop me in the street and ask me questions, and that's fine. But that made me think, am I ready to accept that as part of my life? And for my family as well, because they were very interested in the early days in our families as well. And so that's a serious decision you have to make about whether, and this is the same thing for politics, you're in the public domain, and you are, everything you do, whether you do things right or you do things wrong, is visible to the public. So you want to think seriously about whether you're prepared to take that risk and are willing to accept the fact that you will be criticized sometime. And to me, that is part of life. If you feel that you have strong convictions about doing something, I would say don't shy away from it. I've met too many people who, when they arrive at the end of their professional life and they retire, they may have had a good professional life, but some of them have said, I wish I had done that. But they didn't. They played it safe. And you only have one life. So take some risks and try some things, and don't worry if you fail, because sometimes you'll succeed.
Thank you so much. And I'll now turn things over to you both if you have any closing comments.
Nothing more for me, but thank you for coming out tonight, and such a wonderful audience, and thanks for your very good questions. Thank you, and thank you for the Chef Boyardee.
I'll just add my thanks. As I mentioned, a kid who wanted to be an astronaut to be sitting next to one. It's remarkable. I think we're here in part to celebrate someone who broke ground for Canada by doing it as high as possible from above the ground, doing it in space. And for you to have shared, made space for us here tonight. The story is, this book is a remarkable one that talks about professional highs, personal lows, pickles, wrenches, and in the sequel, perhaps, Chef Boyardee. Anyways, thank you, Mark. May you live long and prosper.
I'm just going to go back to the signing table.
Oh, would you go to Mars with or without Elon?
If I'm going to Mars, I want this guy riding shotgun.
Thank you both so much, and thank you all very, very much. My colleague Chris will now lead Mark over to the signing table and get him all set up. We'll ask you just to remain in place to ensure that you can all make it there as well. There we go. So just a few quick notes about the signing procedure for this evening. I will wander down the line with some Post-it notes to write your name down, which is not because we don't trust you to be able to spell it when you get to the table. It just makes it easier to actually chat when you get up there rather than spending all your time doing exactly that. We'll be going down the line and passing out copies of the book. Please do feel free to get a copy of the book signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book. Both the store and Penguin Random House will be very appreciative. And we're so grateful to Penguin Random House for this evening, to Signal for publishing this book, And I will ask you for 2 more rounds of applause. The first, of course, for our host, Paul Samyn. And of course, because he's close enough to hear it, please give a very raucous round of applause for Marc Garneau. Have a wonderful night, everyone.